Well, good evening again and welcome. We're going to continue in our series in Daniel tonight. And so, if you've been with us, we've done Daniel chapter 1 and 2. We're going to be in Daniel 3 this evening. And just like the other chapters, Daniel chapter 3 is much longer than what we normally cover together. So, we're not going to have someone read the entire scripture passage for us tonight. We're just going to work our way through it as we read it. Otherwise, it would take us 20 minutes just to read the passage, and then you still have to listen to me ramble. So, I just choose to let you listen to me ramble, and we'll read the passage as we go. But Daniel chapter 3 is probably going to be a familiar story for some of us. If you've grown up in church, if you have any understanding of the Bible and you kind of know how the Bible stories go, this is the story of Daniel's three friends and the fiery furnace. And if you are not familiar with this story, you're in luck because it also means tonight that you're not going to have to try to deconstruct a bunch of things that are going on in the story and go, I always thought this meant one thing and it was teaching me one thing. And we're not saying that's wrong. We're just saying there's something more behind it. Because I would say I grew up in church. I knew the Bible stories. I heard this Bible story a whole lot. I mean, I can even remember being a little kid and like this was the best picture book or the best story book to go to, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, they're going to get thrown in the furnace and the fourth man's going to appear. Like it was a fun one to read. And normally if you've grown up in church or you've heard the story before, like the takeaway from it was you stand for God no matter what it's going to cost you. Which is a valid point. I'm not saying that point is wrong. We're going to look at it a little bit differently tonight. But if you grew up in church youth groups like I did, you would hear this story read or preached, or you would read it. You go, yeah, take a stand for God no matter what it costs you. And you'd get all inspired and be like, yeah, tomorrow I'm going to go to school and I'm going to stand in the middle of the cafeteria and I'm going to pray, even if they suspend me. And that was never really a threat for actually happening, but you were like, I'm going to take a stand for Jesus because I'm bold and I'm going to be like Daniel and his friends. And listen, if you have children and you read them this story, that's a great takeaway. I'm not saying it's wrong, just saying there's more to it. There's more of what Daniel's trying to communicate to us, what's happening in the story, than just, hey, boldly take a stand for God, even when it costs you. I think Daniel's even trying to show us how we boldly take a stand for God, even when it costs us. And what Daniel says about how we take a stand is radically different from what we honestly think we're supposed to do sometimes. And so we're going to look through that tonight. Read with me if you will. If you have a Bible on your phone or in front of you, you can read it there. We'll have the verses up on the screen as well. But Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. So King Nebuchadnezzar, same king we've seen for the past 2 chapters, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. All right, so if any of you have not measured anything in cubits recently, cubits is roughly 90 feet tall. All right, so 90-foot tall statue is what Nebuchadnezzar has made out of pure gold. So if you need some reference for that, think the Statue of Liberty. Don't measure the base that the Statue of Liberty sits on, but just the statue itself is 111 feet tall. So Nebuchadnezzar has built a statue of gold that is just slightly smaller than the Statue of Liberty. So that's what you're imagining when he's built this thing. It's made of pure gold. We'll talk about what the statue might be in just a minute here. But he puts it out in the plains of Dura, which is about 95 miles east of Babylon proper. It's just out in the country. And then he's going to invite the most important people to come and bow down to this statue. So he says in verse 2, then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of all of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So that's all just to say he's getting the most important people to show up at this event. If you work for the government, if you are helping to rule Babylon, you are supposed to be at this event and you will do what Nebuchadnezzar says, which is, in verse 4, the herald proclaims to them aloud, you are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are all to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. All right, so now they've got the fanfare. Everyone who is someone, government officials, celebrities, they've got the whole band out there. Like, this is a show. Hundreds, if not thousands of people are in the plain of Dura now, gazing at this massive 90-foot statue of pure gold. And they're told, listen, when the band starts to play, and I'm just going to be honest with you, I don't know what a trigon is. I could probably have looked that up this week, but Jamin probably knows, and he can play it for us next week as part of the praise team. Right, but they've got bagpipes, they've got trumpets, they've got harps, they've got it all. It's going to be amazing. And when you hear it, right, I mean, just picture this. This is going to step on some toes, but just picture this. Like if you've been at like the huge Christian concert, everyone knows what to do, right? When the bass drops, what do? Everybody's hands go up. Yeah, we're worshiping God, and you get the goosebumps and the Holy Spirit and all of that, right? This is basically what Nebuchadnezzar wants. When you hear it and the goosebumps come and the bass drops, everyone just bow and you worship this statue that I have created, this 90-foot tall statue, and if you don't, I'm going to throw you into a burning, fiery furnace, which is just redundant. Like he's really making his point. It's going to be fiery and hot and burning, and I'm throwing you in there if you don't bow down and worship this image and worship this statue that I've created. Now, it's interesting that at no point does Daniel ever tell us what the statue looks like. So normally, what you'll normally hear sometimes in a lot of commentaries, and it could be true, is that Nebuchadnezzar has made a statue of himself. That could be true, especially based off of chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar, we looked at last week, where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream where he is the head of a giant statue. So it could be that now that Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream, Daniel has interpreted the dream for him. He goes, oh, great idea. Let's build a massive statue of me out of pure gold, because he was the head of gold in the dream. We'll make me the entire statue. It'll be really, really big, and everyone can bow down and worship me. That could be. It could be a representation of one of their gods. It could be a combination of that, where King Nebuchadnezzar's head is on the body of one of their gods. It could be a lot of things. But I think there's an intentional reason for why Daniel does not tell us specifically what the statue looks like. And it's because I think Daniel realizes that whoever reads this after me, including us, if I tell them exactly what the statue looks like, they're going to go, oh, whew, I have never once had to bow down to a statue of a Middle Eastern king or a Middle Eastern god. I've never had to bow down to anything that looked like that, so I'm off the hook. Great story, Daniel. Glad you're going to teach us something about you and your friends, but this one doesn't apply to me. And Daniel is saying, no, this very much does apply to you, because it doesn't matter what the statue looks like. And it doesn't matter if it was Nebuchadnezzar or a god or some god Nebuchadnezzar hybrid that they combined. That's not the point. The point is that everyone is tempted to bow down to something. Because what Nebuchadnezzar wants everyone to realize here is that when you bow to this statue, you are saying that if I want life to go well for me in Babylon, I will bow. Because if I don't, life will not go well for me. Very quickly, my life will actually end. He's going to throw me into a fiery, burning furnace if I don't bow. Now, probably no one in this room has ever had to stand out on a plain somewhere, staring at a golden statue and been told, bow, or get thrown into a furnace. But daily, hourly, with social media, we are told, here's how you need to live your life. Here is what you need to do if you want to be accepted. If you want life to go well for you, you will bow. You will conform to what we want, to what we tell you is good and right and true. In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, in Babylon's mind, Babylon defines reality. And this represents our reality, and you will bow to it. And we are all tempted with that. We are all tempted to look at wherever we live, wherever we work, whoever we're with, to say they define reality. They know what's good and true and right, and if I will just submit to them in their way, life will go well for me. And so the trumpets play, the harps get strummed, everything happens, the bagpipes blare, and everyone falls down to worship this statue. And if you jump down to verse 8, now we get to one of the main issues that they're going to face here. Notice at this point, Daniel has not been mentioned, and his three friends have not been mentioned, who have come up before. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Their Hebrew names and their Babylonian names. They have not been brought up yet. But should Daniel and his three friends, should they have probably been there at the statue when all of this happened? Yeah, because they are working in the government. Daniel in chapter 2, he is promoted. He is chief over all of Babylon, the capital city. He's chief over all of the other wise men, and he convinces Nebuchadnezzar to promote his three friends as well. They have their own provinces that they're ruling over. So when it says that all of the satraps and the governors and the treasurers and the justices and the magistrates, all of these government officials, Daniel should be there, his three friends should be there, and now they've got a dilemma. Do we bow or do we not bow? And what is that going to mean for us? So in verse 8, Daniel tells us, therefore at that time, certain Chaldeans or astronomers, wise men, came forward to maliciously accuse the Jews. And they declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. If you're approaching a king, it's always good to suck up a little bit. O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree, in case you don't remember, that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so notice here what happens. Nebuchadnezzar would never have known that they did not bow, and we would have never known that they did not bow, unless these tattletales come along and say, hey, king, you've got some guys over here that you promoted, that you've put in charge of us, and do you remember what you said, that everyone had to bow, and if they didn't bow, they were going to get tossed into a fiery furnace? Well, they didn't bow, and now we want them thrown into the fiery furnace. Do what you said you would do, because they don't like these guys. They're foreigners. They've been given positions of power that they don't think they should have. They're now in charge of true flesh and blood Babylonians. These guys are not, and they're the bosses of these guys. Like, Nebuchadnezzar, let's just get rid of them. They didn't bow, and honestly, we want their jobs. And so you kill them off so that we can get their jobs because we did the right thing, and we came and we told. Now, if you just stop and think about this for a minute, this is fascinating. In terms of, okay, I'm going to be bold and take a stand for God. The question is, how are we bold in taking a stand for God? I mean, think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here for a minute. No one knew they took a stand for God until they got tattled on. They weren't making a big deal about it. So there's a couple of options here. Maybe one option is they hear the decree from Nebuchadnezzar go out that all of these government officials are supposed to come to the plain of Dura and see the statue. And maybe they just say, we know what's going to happen. We know he's probably going to force us to like bow down and worship the thing. We can't do that. So we're just quietly and politely not going to go. We'll just stay home. And if anyone notices, I guess they notice. But if they don't, they don't. And we're just not going to attend the festival of the golden statue or whatever's going to happen. We're just not going to go. Or maybe they do show up and they say, well, there's nothing wrong for us. There's nothing wrong with us being there and looking at the statue and being around everyone. But if it comes down to it and they make us bow and worship the thing, we can't do that. So we'll just kind of step off to the side and just not going to bow. But we're not going to make a big deal about it. And so they're just very polite. They're just very quiet about their obedience to God. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not hear the decree go out that they are to come to the plain of Dura and see this statue. They do not go marching to the plains of Dura with their signs that say, God hates statues, as they march down there, right? They're not doing that. They don't get there to the festival and everything and scream and yell at everyone else who is choosing to bow down to the statue. Don't you all know how wrong you are? Don't you know there's only one true God? He's going to get you for this. This isn't the real God. You're afraid of his fire? Well, wait till you see the fire of my God. It's really hot where you're going. They don't do any of that. They don't show up at Dura with their own replacement statue and say, no, everyone bow to this instead. That's wrong and this is right. They just go, we're either not going to show or we're not going to bow. But just quietly, politely, we're just not going to participate. And that's kind of a bold thing in our culture, right? To just quietly not participate. You don't have to cause a stink about everything. You don't have to be up in arms about everything. So Nebuchadnezzar hears this, and then his reaction is one of furious rage, it says in verse 13. Like this is not livid, this is not angry, this is not furious, this is furious rage that he has towards them. Because notice also in verse 12, at the end of that, how they have accused these three of like the three worst things you could be accused of. They're not paying attention to you, O king, so political problems they're causing you. They don't worship your gods, religious problems they're causing you, and they won't bow to your statue. This is a big cultural moment, Nebuchadnezzar. Everyone was there. Culture war coming, and they've bundled all these three together, and they've said, this is what they're going to cause, and if you don't stamp this out now, it's going to become a bigger issue. So he is in a furious rage, and he commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. So I think, now this is just my speculation, I think at this point their decision was, I'm just not going to show up, because they have to be brought before the king. So bring them to me, because they're not around here right now. Bring them to me and bring them in front of me so that I can have a word with them. So they brought them in before the king. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn and all the musical instruments again, and you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 16, answer and say to Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they have now pushed Nebuchadnezzar's buttons, and they've done all the wrong things. This is now he's going to push their buttons back. I'm going to give you one more chance. We'll bring the band back in. We'll play all the music, and when you're ready and you want to bow down, fine, and we'll pretend this never happened. But if you don't, you are going to be thrown into the furnace, and who can deliver you from my hands? Who is more powerful than me? Now just think about yourself for a moment. If this is you in this situation, and this is now the challenge that is put before you, bow or be thrown into a furnace, and then like the little zinger at the end that the king tosses out is, and who will deliver you from my hands? What is your reaction? Right? Because you're going to take a bold stand for God, even if it costs you. How are you going to take that bold stand for God? I think about me, and I know what my reaction would be, and I'm ready to fight, right? I'm going to have a few choice words for the king. What are you talking about? Haven't we shown you how powerful our God is before? Didn't Daniel show you that he knew not only the interpretation of your dream, but what the dream was without you even telling him? That God showed him? Didn't we eat only vegetable and drink waters when we first showed up here, and we were stronger and healthier than everybody else? You ignorant, dumb pagan. Don't you realize that our God truly is more powerful? And you know what? We're not going to get tossed in the fire. He's going to toss you in the fire. So let's go, right? It's a throwdown. Let's prove our point. Let's show people who's really in charge. And is that what they do? No. These are the most polite guys you have ever met. He throws out the challenge. Who will deliver you out of my hands? And they say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." Like, we're just not going to debate it with you. We're not interested in the theological argument. We're not going to try to hash this out with you right now. Clearly, you are in a bad state of mind. You are not going to have a rational conversation anyway. So we're not going to answer you in this matter. It's not a big deal to us. And even if this is all true, "O king," like they'll still refer to him with his proper title. You are the king. Like, yeah, that's your title. We'll be respectful. We'll be polite towards you. It's fine. And listen, our God, we just believe he will deliver us. And even if he doesn't, that's okay. We can't really explain how it's going to be okay, but that's okay with us. But even if he doesn't deliver us, we just want you to know, "O king," we're not going to worship your gods. We're not going to bow to your statue. It is the most polite thing you've ever heard. These are the most polite guys you have ever seen, and now they have to die. Like, Nebuchadnezzar isn't even going to hear this out. He's not going to go, "Oh, well, you know what? They are really nice. They're not trying to cause a problem. Let's make an exception." No. Now you're going to be thrown into the furnace like I told you you would. So in verse 24, so 19, 20, they get thrown into the furnace. They're bound up. Like, they don't even have time for, like, last words, last meal, anything like that. He summons the guards. They bound them in their cloaks and their robes that they're wearing right then. And Nebuchadnezzar is so mad that he tells them, "Heat the furnace up 7 times hotter than it normally is. It's already a burning, fiery furnace, but make sure it's really hot, 7 times hotter." And they do it. They make it even more intense. The soldiers that are leading them up to this furnace to throw them in it, Daniel tells us the furnace was so hot at that point that the guards who brought them up to throw them into the furnace, they are killed themselves because the furnace is so hot. And they somehow manage to still throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. And at this point, in verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar becomes astonished, and he rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, these other people who are around witnessing this, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered the king, "Yes, true, O king." And he answered, "But I see 4 men unbound and walking around in the midst of the fire. And they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." And then Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that the fire had not had any power over their bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their own bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid to ruin, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." And so there's this miraculous rescue of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to talk about that as we get to the end here in just a moment. But they're miraculously saved and rescued. Again, even with the king's pronouncement at the very end of, "Listen, I make another decree now, that if anyone says anything bad against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're going to tear them limb from limb and burn their houses to the ground, right? Once again, you do not see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego like high-fiving Nebuchadnezzar. It's like, yeah, and can we be the ones who tear them limb from limb? Because we deserve it. Like, they're just like, oh, weird. Please let us go back home. Like, we don't want anyone torn limb from limb, right? So what do we do with all of this, though? Because, again, I think there is something more here than just take a stand for God no matter what it costs you. I think what Daniel's trying to show us is how do we live as Christians in Babylon? How do we take a stand for God even when everything else is against us? Really what the passage is teaching us is how we live as people of faith in Babylon. How do we live as people of faith in Babylon? Because remember what we said in week 1, that Babylon, yes, a real physical, historical place. Modern-day Iraq is where it would be found today. Like a real place with real people, a real king. Nebuchadnezzar is a historical figure. We have documents outside of the Bible that tell us all of that. But what the Bible also does, though, is it makes Babylon a metaphor. Just this trope for people and kingdoms and nations that stand opposed to God and everything that he is for. And so the question really isn't, well, what did Daniel and his friends do? It's, what do we do now? How do we live as people of faith when we live in a world where we might look around and say, I don't think the world is as accepting of God and my values and my morals as I wish they were? How do we stand and take a stand for God in a culture like that? And so there's a theologian by the name of Scott McKnight, and he's written a book on some of this, and he says that there's 4 characteristics of Babylon. And that if you look at these 4 characteristics, it's not only true of historical Babylon that Daniel and his friends were in, but these are the characteristics that the Bible describes Babylon being, even in its metaphorical sense. That this was true of Babylon in the past, it's true of Babylon in the present, and it will be true of Babylon in the future as well. So he says the first one is just arrogance. That Babylon always possesses just an arrogant self-sufficiency about itself. We don't need God. We don't care about the people of God. And we are not committed to the ways of God. We know best. And we are going to define what is good and right and true. That is what Babylon is all about. And so if you remember when we started this 3 weeks ago, we said that Babylon actually appears like on page 5 of the Bible. If you remember the Tower of Babel, and the people said, we're going to build this tower so we can show how great we are. We will make a name for ourselves. We will build a tower that reaches to the heavens. We will make the gods come down. Babel becomes Babylon. That's the trajectory that it's on. So Babylon has always been built upon arrogance. We will make a name. We will define what is good. We know what is right, and we have no need of God. And what Scott McKnight says in his book is he says, listen, don't be quick just to point at some abstract national figure or one particular nation. He says this can apply to anyone, anywhere. And so what he ends up saying is he says one finds arrogance among business owners, small or great, in fathers and families, in bullies in schools, in pastors and church leadership, in mega churches and church plants. Ouch. And in institutions, Christian or not. Like, you can find Babylon anywhere. You could live in Babylon, but you could be Babylon. That your life could be built upon, I define for myself what is good and true and right. I define what is going to make me valuable. And I don't care what God says about it. My life is not founded upon that. It's built upon arrogance and my own reasoning of what I have determined to be good and true and noble. The second thing he says is that there's economic exploitation. That Babylon economically exploits others for its own prosperity. See, this was true in Daniel's day. It's true throughout the course of the rest of the Bible as well. Babylon taxed people to the max, Babylon stole and plundered from every nation that they ever went into just so they could get the money, just so they could go into the treasury and make themselves richer. We don't care about you. We don't care how horrible your life is. Now that you're under our control and our command, we only want to better ourselves. We really don't care about you. It says the third characteristic is militarism. It's not just referring to military might, but it's this addiction to power, and I have to be in control, and I have to stay in control. Right? So again, don't just think about this in terms of some singular nation with some military, and it only applies to that. But am I a kind of person who says, I have to be in control, and I have to be in charge, and I have to be in power, and I will stay in control, and I will stay in power no matter what? Even if it means I have to step on other people to get there and stay there, because life is all about me. It's a characteristic of Babylon. And then the fourth thing is he says it's just oppression, that Babylon crushes anyone who would speak or act out against it. See that with Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You're not going to bow. You're not going to worship. I crush you. You go into the furnace, because there will be no resistance. There will be no going against what Babylon has said is good and right and true. And so again, the question becomes, how do you live in light of all of that? Not just, will you take a stand for God even if it costs you, but how will you take a stand for God even when it costs you? And I think Daniel tells us three things. There's three ways we can apply everything that we've seen from Daniel chapter 3 of how we live as people of faith in Babylon, who would all say, yes, I will take a stand for God if it costs me. But is it a stand? Is it a way in which God wants us to stand? So number one, people of faith living in Babylon live a quiet and faithful life. People of faith living in Babylon live a quiet and faithful life. So again, you think back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Does this mean that you can't have a say in anything, that you should just keep your mouth shut when you see something wrong, that you can't go to government officials, that you can't be a government official? No. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the government. They are in high places in the government. They serve practically at the king's right hand. They are in the midst of all of it. But there is a way, there is a spirit you can have about you where you can say that even in all of that, I can still have a quiet and faithful life. I don't have to be up in arms about everything. Not everything has to be an argument. The way I express my Christian faith does not have to be through belligerence and yelling and screaming and forcing other people to do what I want them to do. But there's a way I can just have a quiet, faithful life that honors God. I can still stand for him. I can still honor him. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do. We're not going to bow. We're not going to get up in arms about it. They don't show up in Dura demanding to go see all the magistrates are there. All the judges are there. They don't demand to go see the chief justice of the Babylonian Supreme Court and say, does this sound legal to you? Should I really have to? They just quietly not going to bow. And if it costs me, it costs me. But I don't have to be a jerk about it as I do this. And this seems to be the theme throughout the entire Bible. If you go all the way over to the New Testament, there's a book called 1 Peter. And Peter is also writing to a group of exiles. Daniel and his friends are exiles in Babylon. Peter is writing to a group of Christian exiles who have been scattered from their homes because of persecution under Rome, and he's now writing to them. How do you live as people of faith in Rome? How do you live as people of faith in Babylon when you're being persecuted as the people of God? How do you live? And what does Peter tell them? He says in 1 Peter chapter 3, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for this is what you were called to, that you may obtain a blessing. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. And have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ as Lord as holy, at always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. And Peter will go on in 1 Peter and say, look, listen, if you're going to suffer, and he's talking to them very personally at this point. He says, if I hear that you're suffering, let me hear that you're suffering for righteousness' sake. Let me hear that you're suffering for just being an obedient follower of Jesus, not because you're a slanderer and you're a busybody and you're a thief and you're just causing problems. Like if you suffer for that, that's on you. But let me hear that you suffer for the sake of righteousness. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he's talking to Christians. He says, make it your ambition, make it your goal, make it your desire to live a quiet life. That you don't have to be angry all the time. And Paul, again, is writing that to a group of people who know what persecution is like. Make it your ambition to live a quiet life. Paul tells Timothy, I want you to pray for your kings and your governors and your mayors and everyone who's in positions of authority. And what does he immediately say after that? Why do I want you to pray for all of those people? So that you can live a quiet and peaceful life, because that is honoring to Christ Jesus. That there is something that is pleasing to Jesus about saying, yes, you will be obedient to me and you will follow me even when it costs you. But there's a way I want you to do that, and I want you to do it quietly and faithfully. I think the second thing that we take away from this is that people of faith living in Babylon are called to be faithful, but not effective. People of faith living in Babylon are called to be faithful, but not effective. Now, this might be the one where we go, hold on, wait a minute, what do you mean? Like, is the church not supposed to grow? Are we not supposed to reach people for Jesus? Are we not supposed to have any kind of effect on the culture around us? And I would say maybe all of those things happen. That I think as we follow Jesus and we follow Jesus well, and people see that there's something about our lives that is drastically different than their lives, they go, wow, I would like to be a part of that. But Jesus never makes a promise that following him, quote unquote, works. He never promises that his way of doing life is the most effective way of doing life. I mean, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount and the things that Jesus calls his followers to do, he says, this is how you will live if you follow me. It's not very effective. When people persecute you, what are you supposed to do? Bless them. Bless and don't persecute in return. When people slander you, what do? You pray for them, and you don't slander them in return. If someone hits you, what do? You turn the other cheek. If someone's your enemy, what do? You love them. If someone says, hey, carry my pack for me, and you don't want to carry the pack for them, what do? You carry it another mile. Like, the way Jesus says to live is not the most effective way if you want to get ahead. If you want to come out on top, following Jesus is probably not going to get you there. Jesus never says, I need you to be effective for me, but he does say, I want you to be faithful. And this is where I think maybe for Daniel and his friends, they understand something that might need to shift in our mindset a little bit as we think about how do we live as people of faith in Babylon. The church is not necessarily here to transform everyone out there. That's not why we exist. We exist because we say we've come in here and we are willing to be transformed by Jesus. The church exists to transform the people who are following Jesus. The church does not exist to transform everyone out there who doesn't believe it anyway. Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they look at this and they go, there's no need for us to argue. There's no need for us to get up in arms and cause a stink and debate and try to force people into doing what we think they ought to do because they don't believe it anyway. But maybe there's a way we could live. Maybe there's a way where our lives could look so appealing that people would follow our God anyway because it's different from anything that they've ever seen, which is pretty much what ends up happening at the very end, right? that the king looks at them and says, who are these guys who would be willing to give up their bodies peacefully for the sake of their God and deny my order? I've never seen anyone do this before. And so because of that, anyone who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, well, there's going to be consequences for them. I'm not saying those are the right consequences. That should not happen. But you get the point? His mind changes. Not because they were belligerent, but because there was something so different about them. And so just as kind of a way of illustration here real quick, I'll bring up the year that should never be mentioned, 2020. And in 2020, I was pastoring a church in Georgia. COVID breaks out. It's not too long before everyone starts taking their sides on that issue. If you don't remember, that was also an election year. We're not going to talk about all that, right? But just suffice it to say here, the good people of Southwest Georgia were not happy. Lots of anger, lots of rage, lots of up in arms. And I'm just thinking to myself as a pastor, like, what do you say in a moment like that? What do you show up on Sunday and preach? Because nothing's going to go well. You're not going to please anybody with what you preach in these moments. And I just thought, I'm just going to preach the words of Jesus, because if anyone gets upset, well, it's at the end of the day, they're kind of just upset with him. And so we did just 6 months in the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And it's just Jesus saying, this is how you live as a Christian. And I just kept making the point week after week after week. Listen, it doesn't matter how upset you are, how wronged you think you have been, how persecuted you think you are. None of that matters. You are not allowed to forfeit the way of Jesus, even if it costs you everything. You cannot forfeit the way of Jesus. And I can just remember I would say that, and every week there would be people who looked at me like, what in the world did you just say? Like, don't you know how bad it is out there? Don't you know that we have to win? Don't you know what we're going to lose if we don't win? Don't you know how horrible the world is going to get? So, Pastor Andrew, we just got to punt on Jesus for a little while, and trust us, we'll get back to him. But we got to make sure we win, and then we can follow Jesus. Once we're on top, then we can follow Jesus. And I'm just going, nowhere in the Bible, and nowhere does Jesus ever say, for the sake of being effective, for the sake of winning, even for the sake of coming out righteous, do you get to forfeit the way of Jesus? Jesus is more concerned about you becoming like him than he is you accomplishing his quote-unquote agenda that he has for the world. Jesus is sovereign. Jesus is in control of the world. He's going to win at the end of the day. He doesn't need you to win for him. He just needs you to become like him. And so people of faith living in Babylon are called to be faithful, not effective. And then we're going to close with this. People of faith living in Babylon, remember that God is with them in the fire. People of faith, remember that God is with them in the fire. So you look at the Sermon on the Mount and you say, how is it possible for me to turn the other cheek? How is it possible for me to love my enemies? How is it possible for me to give my coat to someone I don't like? How is it possible for me to pray for those who persecute me and bless those who hate me? Like, that makes no sense. How is it, like, I'm really going to suffer if I do that. Like, there might be some people who actually walk all over me. Some things in life may not go well for me. I might lose out on some things if I actually live that way. Why in the world would I actually do it? And the answer is because Jesus did it. Because that's the example of the Savior we claim to follow. That Jesus did all of that perfectly. Jesus loved every enemy. Jesus was the most humble person who ever lived, the most gentle person who ever lived, the most kind, the most forgiving, the most merciful. Jesus was the best human who ever lived. And they killed him for it. It wasn't effective. He didn't come out on top. They put him on a cross and said, good. That's what you deserve. And everybody else, if you think he's right, that's what you'll get to. But he did it anyway. And what does Paul tell us, though? That when Jesus was obedient, and obedient to even the point of death on a cross, God highly exalted him because God was in control. And God says, my plan is not always your plan, and my ways are not always your ways. And the way I have about changing people and changing events and working in the world is often very contrary to the way that you want to see it work. So do I call you to suffer at times? Do I call you to give up things at times? Do I call you to even give up your life? Yes. But I will exalt you too, because I exalted him. And so why is it that you can suffer as a Christian? Why is it that you can willingly do that? It's because you have a God who knows what it means to suffer. Christianity is the only religion that says God has suffered himself. God knows what it means to experience pain. He knows what it means to experience betrayal. He knows what it means to experience death. That is crazy. He knows all that. God puts him... The question often becomes, how can there be a loving, good God if there's all this evil and suffering in the world? There can be a good God like that because he has put himself on the hook. He has suffered with you, and he has suffered for you. And we see that in the person of Jesus. And Jesus says, so yeah, might there be a cost to living in Babylon as a person of faith? There might be. And it may not always go the way you want it to go, but I'll be in the fire with you. I know what it means to suffer. And I can promise you can come out the other side because I came out the other side. So Jamin and his team, they're going to come and they're going to get ready to close us out tonight. And maybe there are some of us here this evening who say, you know, I don't like all this idea of suffering for Jesus. I really just wish that I could be a person of faith in Babylon and argue and fight and scream and yell because that seems to be effective and I can win and I can come out on top and I can control some things when that happens. But Jesus says if that's what you're doing, your heart is far from me. You might honor me with your lips, but your heart is far from me. That's not what I'm about. That's not what I want you to be about. Because even when you betrayed me, when you were opposed to me, when you were against me, when you were the one in the crowd who yelled, crucify, 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 I went in the fire for you. So you can go in the fire for me. And because I went in the fire and I came out the other side, you can go through the fire and you can come out the other side. And that's what Jesus calls us to. Just a life of quiet faithfulness that is amazing to a watching world. And so if you would, stand with us tonight.